The sound of my excavator roaring to life at dawn should have been music to my ears. Instead, it was the sound of war being declared. Sheriff Karen stood 50 feet away, screaming over the engine noise, her face red with rage as federal marshals held her back. Behind me, 83 luxury condominiums that she had illegally built on my family land were about to become rubble. She had stolen my property, destroyed my business, and threatened my life. But she made one critical mistake. She messed with a man who owned demolition equipment and knew how to use it. My name is David Mitchell, and until 18 months ago, I lived the kind of quiet life that most people only dream about. 200 acres of pristine countryside stretched out behind my house, land that my grandfather had cleared by hand in 1952, and my father had protected until the day he died. Every morning, I would sit on my back porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun rise over hills that had been in my family for 3 generations. I ran a small demolition company that I had built from nothing. Mitchell Demolition specialized in careful structural removal, the kind of precision work that saved our clients money and kept neighborhoods safe. We were not the biggest operation in the county, but we had a reputation for doing things right. My crew consisted of 3 full-time employees and equipment that I maintained myself. It was honest work that paid the bills and let me live on the land I loved. That peaceful life ended on a Tuesday morning in March when I discovered surveyor stakes planted across my back 40 acres. At first, I assumed it was a mistake. Maybe the county was updating property lines, or perhaps my neighbor was having his land surveyed for insurance purposes. I had dealt with boundary questions before, and they were usually resolved with a phone call and a handshake. But these stakes were different. They formed a grid pattern that stretched across nearly half of my property, and each one was marked with numbers that suggested something far more complex than a simple boundary survey. I followed the line of stakes for almost an hour, growing more confused and concerned with each step. The next morning, I woke to the sound of heavy machinery. I walked to my back fence and saw construction equipment that I did not recognize. A bulldozer was clearing trees near my property line, and a crew of workers was setting up what looked like a construction trailer. I grabbed my coffee and walked down to see what was happening. That was when I first laid eyes on Sheriff Karen Martinez. She was standing next to a black SUV with county markings, talking to what appeared to be a construction foreman. She was not in uniform, but her badge was clearly visible on her belt, and she carried herself with the kind of authority that made it clear she was in charge of whatever was happening on my land. I approached slowly, still assuming this was all some kind of misunderstanding. The foreman noticed me first and nodded in my direction. Sheriff Karen turned to look at me, and I saw something in her eyes that I should have recognized as a warning. It was not confusion or embarrassment at being caught on someone else's property. It was calculation, like she was measuring me as a potential obstacle. "Good morning," I called out as I got closer. "I think there might be some confusion here. This is my property." Sheriff Karen smiled, but it was the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. "Mr. Mitchell, is it? I am Sheriff Martinez. We need to talk." The construction foreman, a weathered man in his 50s named Pete, reached into his truck and pulled out a thick folder of documents. He handed them to me with an apologetic shrug that told me he was just following orders but knew something was not right. "Sorry about the confusion, sir," Pete said, "but we have all the proper permits here. County building permits, environmental clearances, the whole package. All signed by Sheriff Martinez in her capacity as County Development Coordinator." I stared at the papers in disbelief. The permits were official county documents, complete with seals and signatures, authorizing the construction of 83 luxury condominiums across what the documents described as County Development Parcel 447B. The property description matched my land exactly, down to the creek that ran along the eastern boundary. "There has to be some mistake," I said, looking between Pete and Sheriff Corinne. "This land has been in my family for 70 years. I have the deed right in my house." Sheriff Corinne stepped forward, and her voice carried the kind of authority that she was clearly used to having go unquestioned. "Mr. Mitchell, I understand this is confusing, but these permits are legitimate. The county acquired development rights to this property through eminent domain proceedings last year. Perhaps you should consult with an attorney." I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. Eminent domain proceedings. I had never received any notice, attended any hearings, or been contacted by anyone from the county about selling or surrendering my land. I would have remembered something that's significant. "What eminent domain proceedings?" I asked. "I never received any notice about eminent domain." Sheriff Corinne shrugged with practiced indifference. "Mail gets lost sometimes. Legal notices are published in the county paper. It is not my job to make sure property owners are paying attention." I drove straight to the county courthouse, my mind racing with questions and a growing sense that something was terribly wrong. The clerk at the recorder's office was helpful enough, but what she showed me made my blood run cold. According to the county records, my property had been transferred to county ownership 6 months earlier following what was described as failure to respond to eminent domain proceedings. The paperwork looked official, but I knew it was impossible. I had never missed a single piece of mail related to my property. I had never seen any legal notices in the county paper. Most importantly, I had never been contacted by anyone about eminent domain proceedings. I spent the next 3 hours making phone calls that led nowhere. The county attorney's office told me to call the development department. The development department told me to call the sheriff's office. The sheriff's office told me that Sheriff Martinez was unavailable and that I should consult with a private attorney. By the end of the day, I had spoken to 6 different county employees, and every single one of them gave me the same message. The permits were legitimate, the property transfer was legal, and there was nothing anyone could do to help me. That evening, I sat in my kitchen with every property document I owned spread across the table. My grandfather's original deed, my father's inheritance papers, tax records going back decades, and insurance documents that clearly established my ownership of every acre. None of it mattered, according to the county, because Sheriff Corinne had somehow managed to create a parallel set of documents that said the exact opposite. I realized that I was not dealing with a simple bureaucratic mistake or even ordinary corruption. This was systematic, deliberate theft on a scale that required planning, resources, and connections throughout the county government. Sheriff Corinne had not just issued a few questionable permits. She had orchestrated the complete legal theft of my family's land. The worst part was that it was working perfectly. Sheriff Corinne did not wait long to make her next move. 3 days after our first encounter, she showed up at my house in an official county vehicle with 2 deputies in tow. I was working in my garage when I heard the car doors slam, and I knew immediately that this was not a social call. "Mr. Mitchell," she called out as I walked toward them, "we need to discuss your continued trespassing on county development land." I stopped in my tracks, genuinely stunned by the audacity of her statement. "Trespassing? This is my house. This is my property." Sheriff Corinne pulled out a citation book and began writing. "According to county records, you are currently occupying county land without permission. I am issuing you a formal trespass warning. Any further interference with county development activities will result in your arrest." She handed me the citation with the same cold smile I had seen during our first meeting. The document was official county letterhead, complete with case numbers and legal references. It ordered me to cease all unauthorized activities on what it described as county property, and warned that continued violations would result in criminal charges. "This is insane," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "You cannot just steal someone's land and then arrest them for living on it." One of the deputies, a young man who looked uncomfortable with the entire situation, shifted nervously behind Karen. The other deputy, an older man with the weathered look of someone who had been enforcing Karen's orders for years, kept his hand resting casually on his service weapon. "Mr. Mitchell," Sheriff Karen said, her voice taking on a tone of mock patience, "I understand that you are upset about losing your property, but threatening county officials will not help your situation. I suggest you find somewhere else to live while you work through the legal process." Over the next 2 weeks, the harassment escalated in ways that were both systematic and personal. My demolition trucks began receiving citations for minor violations that had never been enforced before. Expired registration stickers that were still valid according to the DMV. Equipment parked improperly on my own property. Safety violations for machinery that had passed county inspection just months earlier. Each citation came with hefty fines and threats of equipment seizure if the violations were not corrected immediately. My business, which had operated without incident for 8 years, was suddenly under constant scrutiny from inspectors who found problems that had never existed before. The phone calls started on a Thursday night. The first call came at 11 p.m., just a hang-up that I assumed was a wrong number. The second call came at 2 a.m., and this time I heard breathing before the line went dead. By the end of the week, I was getting 3 or 4 calls per night, always between midnight and dawn, always just long enough to wake me up. My trucks were vandalized twice in 1 week. Someone slashed the tires on my excavator and poured sugar in the gas tank of my dump truck. The sheriff's department took reports both times, but made it clear that they considered the incidents to be pranks rather than serious crimes. The breaking point came on a Friday afternoon when Sheriff Karen showed up at my business with 3 deputies and a clipboard full of violations. She announced that my demolition license was under review for safety concerns, and that all of my equipment would be impounded pending a full investigation. "This is harassment," I told her as the deputies began photographing my equipment. "You are destroying my business because I will not let you steal my land." Sheriff Karen looked at me with genuine satisfaction, like she was enjoying every moment of my frustration. "Mr. Mitchell, I am simply doing my job. If you cannot operate your business in compliance with county regulations, perhaps you should consider a different line of work." That night, I sat in my kitchen and realized that I was fighting a war I could not win through normal channels. Karen had the power of the badge, the support of county government, and the resources to keep harassing me until I gave up and walked away from everything my family had built. But she had made one critical mistake in her campaign to destroy me. She had chosen to target a man who owned heavy equipment and knew exactly how to use it. I hired Marcus Chen, a private investigator from the state capitol, with money from my rapidly depleting business account. Marcus specialized in government corruption cases, and he had the kind of connections that could dig into records that were not available to ordinary citizens. "This is bigger than one corrupt sheriff," Marcus told me during our first meeting at a diner 30 miles outside the county. "What you are describing sounds like an organized operation with multiple moving parts. Someone is making serious money from these land grabs." Marcus was right. Within 2 weeks, he had uncovered a network of shell companies and offshore accounts that traced directly back to Sheriff Karen and her associates. The luxury condominium project on my land was just one of 7 similar developments planned across the county, each one built on property that had been acquired through questionable legal proceedings. The investigation revealed that Karen had been systematically targeting elderly landowners and people who lived alone on large parcels of rural property. Her method was always the same: create fake eminent domain proceedings, file forged documents with the county recorder, and then use her authority as sheriff to intimidate anyone who tried to fight back. Marcus showed me financial records that detailed millions of dollars in payments from Pinnacle Development Corporation, a company based in Delaware with ties to real estate investors from 3 different states. Karen was not just a corrupt, small-town sheriff. She was a key player in a criminal enterprise that had been stealing land and destroying lives for at least 5 years. "Look at this," Marcus said, spreading photographs across the table. Margaret Coleman, 86 years old, lost her farm to the same fake eminent domain process. Thomas Wright lost his hunting cabin and 40 acres. Sarah Mitchell. Wait, is she related to you? My blood ran cold as I looked at the photograph. Sarah Mitchell was my great-aunt, my grandfather's sister, who had died 3 years earlier. According to Marcus's research, her property had been seized by the county just 2 months after her funeral, using the same forged documents and fake legal proceedings that Karen had used against me. "She died without children," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Her land was supposed to go to my father, but he died 6 months after she did. I never followed up on the inheritance because I assumed the lawyers would handle everything." Marcus nodded grimly. "Karen has been targeting people exactly like that. Elderly property owners, people who die without clear heirs, anyone who might not have the resources or knowledge to fight back. You are actually the first person who has tried to resist her operation." The scope of Karen's criminal enterprise was staggering. Marcus estimated that she had stolen over 2,000 acres of prime real estate worth at least $20 million. Her network included the county attorney, 3 county commissioners, and at least half a dozen other officials who had been receiving regular payments through various shell companies. "The good news," Marcus said, "is that we have enough evidence to bring federal charges. Mail fraud, conspiracy, abuse of office under color of law. Karen is looking at serious prison time when this all comes out." "What about my land?" I asked. "What about getting my property back?" Marcus smiled for the first time since I had hired him. "That is where things get interesting. All of Karen's permits and land transfers are based on forged documents. Once we prove that the original eminent domain proceedings were fraudulent, every single permit she issued becomes invalid. That means every building constructed on your property was built without proper authorization." I felt a spark of hope for the first time in months. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means that, legally speaking, those condominiums are essentially giant code violations sitting on your property. And as the rightful property owner, you would have every right to have them removed." Armed with Marcus's evidence, I filed a federal lawsuit that laid out the entire scope of Karen's criminal operation. The complaint included bank records, forged documents, recorded phone conversations, and testimony from other victims who had finally found the courage to come forward. The federal prosecutor assigned to the case was a sharp woman named Janet Rodriguez who specialized in public corruption. She reviewed Marcus's evidence for 3 days before calling me into her office with news that would change everything. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, "we have enough evidence to charge Sheriff Martinez with mail fraud, conspiracy, and civil rights violations under color of law. But I want to offer you something that might be even better than a conviction. She explained that federal law allowed property owners to seek immediate injunctive relief when local officials had violated their civil rights through the abuse of government power. In my case, that meant I could potentially get a court order that would not only restore my property rights, but also authorize the immediate removal of any structures that had been built without proper permits. The beauty of this approach, Janet explained, is that we do not have to wait for a criminal trial. If we can prove that Karen's permits were fraudulent, which we can, then everything built under those permits becomes an illegal structure that must be removed immediately. I felt a cold smile cross my face as the implications became clear. You are saying I could legally tear down those condominiums. I am saying that as the rightful property owner, you would have not only the right but potentially the obligation to remove illegal structures from your land. And since you happen to own a demolition company, you would be uniquely qualified to handle that removal yourself. The federal court hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in early October. Karen appeared with a team of expensive lawyers who clearly had not expected to be facing federal charges based on such overwhelming evidence. I watched from the gallery as Janet methodically destroyed every aspect of Karen's defense. The judge, a stern man in his 70s who had been dealing with corruption cases for decades, listened to 3 hours of testimony before rendering his decision. He ruled that Karen had indeed violated my civil rights through the systematic abuse of her official power, and he issued an immediate injunction restoring my full property rights. But the best part came at the end of his ruling. Furthermore, the judge said, looking directly at Karen, the court finds that all building permits issued by the defendant were obtained through fraudulent means and are therefore null and void. All structures built under these invalid permits are hereby declared to be in violation of county building codes and must be removed within 30 days. Karen's lawyers immediately requested a stay of the judge's order, but Janet was ready for that move. She presented evidence that Karen had been continuing her criminal activities even after the federal investigation began, including attempts to intimidate witnesses and destroy evidence. Your Honor, Janet said, the defendant has shown a complete disregard for the law and cannot be trusted to comply with any court orders that are not immediately enforced. The plaintiff has the means and expertise to remove these illegal structures safely and efficiently. I see no reason to delay justice any further. The judge agreed. He denied the stay and gave me explicit authorization to begin demolition operations immediately, provided that I obtained proper permits and followed all safety regulations. As we left the courthouse, Karen tried one last desperate move. She approached me in the parking lot with 2 deputies and announced that she was placing me under arrest for conspiracy to commit destruction of property. I would not do that if I were you, Sheriff, Janet said, stepping between us. Mr. Mitchell is now under federal protection as a witness in an ongoing corruption investigation. Any attempt to interfere with his lawful activities will be considered obstruction of justice. Karen stared at me with pure hatred, but she knew she was beaten. Her criminal enterprise was crumbling, her illegal permits had been voided, and she was facing federal charges that could put her in prison for decades. That night, I called my demolition crew and told them to report to work early. We had the biggest job of our careers waiting for us, and it was going to be the most satisfying work any of us had ever done. I arrived at my property before dawn on a crisp October morning, with 3 excavators, 2 bulldozers, and a crew of 8 men who had been waiting months to see justice served. The first rays of sunlight illuminated 83 luxury condominiums that had no legal right to exist on my family's land. My demolition permit, signed by federal marshals and backed by a court order, was posted prominently on my truck where everyone could see it. Unlike Karen's fraudulent documents, this permit was absolutely legitimate and gave me explicit authority to remove every illegal structure from my property. The first building came down at 7 a.m. sharp. I had chosen to start with the largest condominium, a 3-story structure that sat exactly where my grandfather's old apple orchard had been. As my excavator bit into the exterior wall, I felt a satisfaction that was deeper than any emotion I had experienced in months. Sheriff Karen arrived at 7:15, screaming before she was even out of her vehicle. She had brought 4 deputies with her, and she was carrying a clipboard full of what I assumed were more fraudulent citations and arrest warrants. "Shut down this operation immediately," she shouted over the roar of heavy machinery. "You are destroying county property." I climbed down from my excavator and walked over to where she was standing. The federal marshals who had been assigned to protect me during the demolition operation stepped forward to ensure that Karen kept her distance. "Sheriff Martinez," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "these buildings were constructed illegally on my property using fraudulent permits that you issued. I have a federal court order authorizing their removal, and I intend to carry out that order to the letter." Karen's face turned red with rage as she realized that all of her power and authority meant nothing in the face of federal law enforcement. "This is not over, Mitchell. I will have you arrested for destruction of property." One of the federal marshals, a professional woman in her 40s, stepped forward with her own clipboard. "Sheriff Martinez, you are hereby ordered to cease interfering with these lawful demolition activities. Any attempt to obstruct Mr. Mitchell's court-authorized actions will result in your immediate arrest for contempt of federal court." As word spread through the county, people began arriving to watch the demolition. Many of them were other victims of Karen's land grab schemes, elderly farmers and rural property owners who had lost their land to the same fraudulent legal proceedings that had been used against me. Margaret Coleman, the 86-year-old woman who had lost her farm, stood at the edge of my property with tears in her eyes as she watched the second building come down. "I never thought I would see justice," she told me during a brief break in the demolition. "That woman destroyed my family's legacy, but at least now people will know the truth." By noon, I had demolished 12 condominiums, and a crowd of nearly 200 people had gathered to watch. Local news crews arrived and began interviewing victims of Karen's corruption while filming the systematic destruction of her illegal development project. The demolition took on the feeling of a community celebration. People brought folding chairs and coolers, and someone even set up a food truck to serve lunch to the crowd. Children played in the open fields while their parents watched decades of corruption being literally torn down before their eyes. Karen made several more attempts to stop the demolition throughout the day, each time being turned away by federal marshals who were clearly enjoying their role in the proceedings. By mid-afternoon, she had given up on direct confrontation and was standing near her vehicle, making angry phone calls to lawyers and county officials who could no longer help her. The most satisfying moment came when I demolished the condominium that had been built directly over my grandfather's old workshop. As the walls came down, I could see the concrete foundation that he had poured in 1954, still solid after 70 years. Karen had tried to erase my family's history, but she had not been able to destroy the foundation that everything else was built on. Each building that fell represented more than just the removal of an illegal structure. It was the restoration of justice, the vindication of everyone who had been victimized by Karen's corruption, and proof that sometimes the system actually works when good people refuse to give up. By sunset, 43 condominiums had been reduced to neat piles of sorted debris. My crew worked with the precision and efficiency that comes from years of experience, and every piece of material was separated for proper disposal and recycling. As I shut down my excavator at the end of the day, the crowd burst into applause. Sheriff Karen was nowhere to be seen. The demolition continued for 3 more days, with media coverage that grew larger each day. By the end of the week, the story of Sheriff Karen's corruption and my fight for justice had been picked up by national news networks and newspapers across the country. Karen was arrested on federal charges while I was demolishing the final row of condominiums. I watched from my excavator as federal agents led her away in handcuffs, her career and criminal enterprise finally coming to an end. The sight of her being arrested on the same property she had tried to steal was a moment of justice that I will remember for the rest of my life. The federal investigation that followed revealed the full scope of Karen's criminal network. County Attorney David Walsh was arrested for conspiracy and money laundering. 3 county commissioners were charged with accepting bribes and falsifying public records. The entire county government was placed under federal oversight while prosecutors sorted through years of corruption and fraud. Pinnacle Development Corporation, the company that had been funding Karen's land grab operation, saw its assets frozen and its executives charged with racketeering. The shell companies and offshore accounts that Marcus had discovered were shut down by federal authorities, and millions of dollars in stolen money was recovered for restitution to victims. My phone rang constantly for weeks as other victims of Karen's schemes came forward with their own stories. Margaret Coleman got her farm back. Thomas Wright recovered his hunting cabin and 40 acres. My great-aunt Sarah's property, which I had never known was stolen, was returned to my family's estate. The media attention transformed my personal battle into a symbol of resistance against government corruption. I gave interviews to newspapers, magazines, and television shows, always emphasizing that the real victory belonged to everyone who had been victimized by Karen's abuse of power. My demolition company experienced an unexpected surge in business as property owners across the region called requesting services from the guy who took down the corrupt sheriff. The high-profile nature of the case gave my business a reputation for integrity and precision that no amount of advertising could have purchased. But the most meaningful recognition came from my neighbors and community members who had watched me fight for justice when everyone else said it was impossible. The annual county fair that fall featured a booth displaying photographs and newspaper clippings from Karen's arrest and trial, a permanent reminder that corruption cannot survive when good people refuse to accept it. The financial restitution process took months to complete, but eventually every victim of Karen's land grab schemes received compensation for their losses. The money came from the seized assets of Pinnacle Development Corporation and Karen's personal accounts, which contained millions of dollars in illegal profits. My family's land was fully restored to its original condition, with the illegal condominiums replaced by native grass and wildflowers. The scars left by Karen's construction equipment gradually healed, and the property began to look the way it had when my grandfather first cleared it 70 years earlier. Sheriff Karen Martinez was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison on charges of mail fraud, conspiracy, civil rights violations, and racketeering. The judge who sentenced her called her crimes a systematic betrayal of public trust that destroyed lives and corrupted the very institutions meant to protect citizens from abuse. During her sentencing hearing, I was allowed to give a victim impact statement that I had been preparing for months. I talked about the sleepless nights, the financial stress, and the emotional toll of watching my family's legacy being stolen by someone who had sworn an oath to protect and serve the community. Your Honor, I concluded, Sheriff Martinez did not just steal my land. She tried to steal my faith in justice itself. But she failed in that effort because this courtroom and this sentence prove that the system still works when good people refuse to give up. Karen showed no remorse during the sentencing hearing. She maintained her innocence even in the face of overwhelming evidence, claiming that she had been the victim of a politically motivated prosecution. Her lack of accountability only reinforced my belief that she deserved every day of her prison sentence. The financial restitution paid to all victims totaled over $18 million, money that had been recovered from the criminal enterprise that Karen had built over 5 years of systematic corruption. For many victims, particularly elderly property owners who had lost family land, the money could never truly compensate for what had been stolen. But it represented acknowledgement that they had been wronged and that justice had been served. My demolition company grew into one of the most respected operations in the state, with clients calling from hundreds of miles away specifically requesting our services. The case had demonstrated not only our technical expertise, but also our commitment to doing what was right even when it was difficult and dangerous. More importantly, the publicity surrounding Karen's prosecution led to significant reforms in county government oversight and property transfer procedures. New laws were passed requiring multiple levels of approval for eminent domain proceedings, and property owners were given stronger protections against fraudulent legal actions. The story became a case study in criminal justice schools and government ethics courses, an example of how individual citizens can fight back against corruption when they have the courage and resources to do so. I received letters from law students, journalism students, and ordinary citizens who said that my fight had inspired them to stand up against injustice in their own communities. 3 years later, I still live on my family's land, and every morning I sit on my back porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun rise over hills that are now forever protected from corruption and greed. The property is in my name, recorded with legitimate deeds and backed by federal court orders that no county official can ever challenge. The demolition equipment that was once threatened with seizure by Karen's harassment campaign now sits in a larger facility, maintained and ready for the next job. My crew has grown to 12 full-time employees, and we have expanded into commercial and industrial demolition projects across 3 states. But the most important lesson I learned was not about business success or legal victory. It was about the importance of fighting back when powerful people abuse their authority to harm others. Sheriff Karen counted on my silence, my compliance, and my willingness to accept injustice rather than risk everything to fight it. She was wrong about me, and she was wrong about justice.